Hello, I'm John Barnes, Executive Director of Funders Concerned About AIDS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's launch of Philanthropic Support to Address HIV/AIDS 2019. This is the 18th edition of our annual resource tracking effort and represents a pre-COVID look at the state of HIV philanthropy. Having been here for 12 of the 18 releases, I've come to realize there are three important factors to pay attention to. First, the volume of funding, how much funding was provided overall. Second, the responsiveness of the funding, how well the funding aligns with needs. And third, sustainability of the funding, how solid the funding base is. It's tempting to focus just on the overall amount of funding, but that hasn't changed all that much over the last few years and can lead to a false sense of security overshadowing the disturbing trends of the other two measures. You'll hear more about that on today's call. I'd like to thank our guest speakers today, Paul Gilbert Colataz from Red Umbrella Fund and Darwin Thompson of Gilead Sciences. And with that, I'll turn it over to our resident resource tracking guru, Kat Charanda.
Thanks, John, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I have to apologize in advance for the sound of my voice. I've recently come in contact with germs after a year on sabbatical from them. So I'm sure folks are understanding and experiencing similar things themselves. Just a few logistics before we dive in. All attendees will be on mute as we are in webinar mode, and the session will be recorded. If you want to offer comments, you can do so in the chat box or use the Q&A to ask questions throughout the presentation. Additionally, we're going to do a little Zoom polling to create a little more interactive space. So to start, I just want to introduce myself again. My name is Kat Charanda. I'm the Research and Program Manager with Funders Concerned About AIDS. And before I dive into a little of the report, we just want to get a sense of how familiar folks are with the resource tracking report. So this is a little Zoom poll that you should see on your screen now that just, if you can take a moment to answer, just to get a sense of how familiar you are. We'll give you all a minute, and then when that's done, Sarah can share the results with everyone so we can get a sense of who's on the call with us today and their familiarity with the report. All right. We've been submitting data for centuries with the win, and a few folks who heard about it from their data friend. Okay, so it looks like we've got some folks who have a lot of familiarity and some who are a little newer to it. So if we can go to the next slide, Sarah. Just to gauge, just for the folks who are familiar with the report, I wanted to start off by sharing a few things that are new this year. But just my standard context for those who are new to the report. FCAA collects, codes, and analyzes HIV-related grants that were dispersed in calendar year 2019. So all of the data we're discussing today will be from 2019. Hence the title of the webinar and John's opening remarks. We're really trying to capture what HIV philanthropy before COVID-19 looked like. So we can use this as a benchmark to really understand how COVID has changed the funding landscape as we move into data collection for next year's report. So with that said, here are a few things that are new this year. We changed design companies. We worked with a fabulous firm called Brevity and Wit. They are social justice oriented designers, equity focused, and a women of color owned firm. And we're really excited about the results in this year's report. We've also added some editor's notes throughout that offer a little perspective on the data and some additional discussion points. So I think it's a really good way for readers to navigate the report. So keep an eye out for those editor's notes. We've included a section on pre-COVID-19 benchmarks. And while the whole report does this in some ways, we are calling out here specific issue areas that we know have been pivotal to communities before the pandemic, but that we especially want to keep an eye on the resourcing of these areas as we move forward. We've used some prevalence data to understand impacts of the epidemic regionally, both within the US and globally, and we've compared those to percentages of funding to really understand how philanthropy is responding to those most impacted regions. So I think those offer a great comparison to some outside data. We've, we've scratched the surface and just beginning to shift some of our language to ensure it's a little more equitable and humanizing, moving away from some of that metric and data-driven language. And we've reformatted our populations of focus table, so the data is a little more visually palatable this year, and it kind of buckets categories. So you'll see a little sneak peek of that a little later in the presentation. And finally, we've added a call out on Bipod communities. In addition to some of the other call outs we've previously included, like for key populations globally. The elephant in the room, of course, is that while this data is tracking pre-COVID-19 funding levels, the data collection itself occurred during the pandemic. And this posed many challenges, as you can imagine, for our own work, and certainly for funders to be able to find the time and capacity to submit data to us. So we do see a sharp decline in the number of funders represented in this year's report. And while some of that was likely due to COVID-19, there were additional factors, and we go into a little more detail on that in the report, in the overview. So we can go to the next slide and dive into some of the data. The headline from this year's report is that we tracked nearly $706 million in philanthropic giving to HIV and AIDS that was dispersed in 2019. This coming from 264 funders in the form of more than 5,600 grants going to over 3,000 grantees. This was the highest total that we have tracked to date, and a 7% increase from the 2018 total. But if we go to the next slide, we know that, of course, there's always a caveat here. Sarah, if you can go to the next slide there. That the caveat, of course, is that this increase that we saw, the 7%, was driven by a $100 million disbursement in 2019 by the Philip T. and Susan M. Reagan Foundation that went towards HIV research. So without that, we would have seen an 8% decrease overall. But a more accurate way of understanding this fluctuation is to look at the change we see only from funders we were able to collect data from in 2018 and 2019. So this is what we call our same set of funders comparison. And through this lens, we saw an 11% increase in overall funding, but when we remove that $100 million Reagan gift, we're looking at a 4% decrease of about $27 million. And while we always want to celebrate these increases and large gifts such as these, we also want to be sure it does not obscure what the rest of the field looks like. And what we're seeing really is further concentration of funding at the top and a shrinking number of funders in this space. If we go to the next slide, we can, excuse me, you can see the top 20 funder list with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation at the top as in previous years with $224 million in funding. And Gilead Sciences as the number 2 funder with $167 million. And then this year, with the Reagan Foundation at the number 3 slot with that $100 million gift. And just to clarify, the overall gift from the Reagan Foundation was actually a $200 million. If you may have read about it. Our outreach turned up that about 50% of the funding would go to what was considered HIV-specific work. And with large grants like that, we often try and identify how much of it is HIV-specific, and that's why we've included $100 million here. For the first time this year, we examined how many of the top 20 funders were FCAA members. And it turns out that 15 of the top 20 are members. And despite FCAA membership only representing 13% of all funding organizations, their combined grant making accounted for roughly 50% of all giving in 2019. So we're really proud of FCAA's membership and those numbers. We also added a column this year to that top 20 grant makers chart that you can see on the far right. That includes the percent of total grant making made up by the foundation's HIV-related giving. This exercise was really just to help us understand the landscape of the field even further. Since we know that the funding is so heavily concentrated in this top 20 list, in fact, 92% of all funding in 2019 came from these top 20 funders. So it just gives us a better sense of what that landscape looks like. If we go to the next slide, we're still looking at the top grant makers here, but you can see that concentration that I'm talking about more visually. So the top funder, the Gates Foundation, representing 31% of the entire field, and the top 2 funders over 50%. And that third bubble there, the red one, is funders 3 through 20, representing 39% this year, but that's definitely inflated because of Reagan coming in as the number 3 funder with that gift. Excuse me. This new visual also gives you a sense of the number of funders that are included in each of these bubbles via that bar that you see across the bottom. So that 2% of funding all the way on the far right, that small light blue color, accounts for 214 funders in this year's tracking out of the 264 total funders. We also always break out how many corporate and HIV-specific funders we tracked. So 33% of funding this year coming from corporate funders, and 19% of funding coming from HIV-specific funders. And while there were only 27 HIV-specific funders tracked overall, 10 of them were in the top 20 list this year. So a significant amount of funding coming from those folks. This, of course, also means that 81% of funders and 50% of the top 20 were non-HIV-specific funders. And this, again, helps us to better understand the intentional and also the intersectional landscape that's necessary to address HIV and AIDS. If we go to the next slide, it's a little bit on those pre-COVID-19 benchmarks that I mentioned. We want to draw attention to certain strategies and populations that are particularly in need of funding for communities that are weathering the impacts of COVID-19. And this is just a glimpse of what this looks like. You can see right off the bat already from all of those red decreasing arrows that from 2018 to 2019, pre-COVID, we're seeing decreases to a lot of these areas. So general operating support down 13%, advocacy down 4%, funding for key populations down 12%, and social services down 29%. Low and middle income countries down 32% overall. And within the US, we saw a rise in national level grants, but a decline in local level funding. And I'm going to talk a little more about all of these down the line, but all of these were areas that were already in dire need of sustained or increased funding prior to the pandemic. And to see these decreasing funding levels before we even move into tracking pandemic level funding is extremely concerning. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So zooming in on the US for a moment, we saw the 6th consecutive year of increases to the US, capping at $212 million in 2019. We did a new analysis this year looking at the distribution of funding by national, regional, and state level grants. And as you can see, we saw 66% of US funding going to work at the national level, with 30% going to the state level and 4% region-wide. And just to be clear, we don't track this by the location or the scope of the grantee organization, but rather by the scope of the grant itself. So if an organization that works at the national level, but was for a project within 1 or 2 states, we're going to count that as state level funding. If we go to the next slide, sticking with the US epidemic, we saw the national level grants, as I mentioned, increase quite dramatically in 2019 to the tune of 35% increase, reaching almost $140 million. And state and regional level grants both saw decreases, and the regional decreases are listed there on the screen. So 42% decrease in the West, 28% decrease in the Northeast, and so forth. And you can see the percentages of the funding as it's distributed across each region on that visual as well. If we go to the next slide, kind of zoom in on funding to the US South a little bit to better understand if funding aligned with need within the US. This is another one of those prevalence charts that I mentioned. We look at the percentage of funding by US region alongside the percentage of people living with HIV and AIDS per region. And while the trajectory of funding followed the trend of prevalence in some ways, we still see very clear gaps in the response. So for example, to the US South, where 45% of people living with HIV in the US are located, but only 17% of philanthropic funding for HIV was directed. We did see funding to the US South decrease by about 4% this year, but this is after we saw dramatic increases in 2017 due to the rollout of several initiatives directing significant funding to the South. And that includes the Southern HIV Impact Fund and Gilead's Compass Initiative, among others. And we do know that some of the 2017 funding were multi-year grants and are still being distributed to grantees through the Compass operating centers. So that decrease maybe looks a little more steady. We can go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the international and global epidemics. This is one of those prevalence charts as well. This chart takes the percent of people living with HIV per global region and compares these percentages to HIV philanthropy for comparable regions. So you can see a few things of note from this chart. Western and Central Europe and North America that first bar on the left, receiving 34% of funding in blue, but possessing only 6% of people living with HIV. And in contrast, the next bar, East and Southern Africa, receiving 19% of the funding in blue, but with 55% of people living with HIV. And you can see that there are smaller gaps that exist in other regions as well, in Asia and the Pacific, Western and Central Africa, and so forth. Just to clarify, the UNAIDS data that we used from the UNAIDS Data 2020 report did lump Western and Central Europe and North America together. And so we did the same with our funding data to be able to make this comparison. But clearly the funding to the US is dramatically inflating that section. And that's not an accurate representative of what Western and Central Europe's comparison might look like individually. If we go to the next slide, in the same vein, we saw that the vast majority of country level funding went to high income countries. That was, again, predominantly driven by the US, and that's that top bar at 237 million. And unfortunately, funding to low and middle income countries decreased by 32% overall in 2019, with low income and upper middle income countries seeing significant drops to the tune of 47 and 43% respectively. I will say there were a couple of grant makers that fund in this region that we were not able to track funding for this year. However, even their combined funding would not explain the whole of the significant declines we saw in the region this year. I want to move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about the intended use or strategy that we see broken down here on the chart. As is typical, research is the top funded category, but it did see a significant increase due to the Reagan grant, totaling $305 million in 2019. Prevention and treatment closely follow at second and third, and advocacy holding the line in fourth, having seen a slight 4% decrease this year, but remaining fairly steady over the last 4 years, but not seeing the increases that we've been calling for. We saw a concerning 29% drop in social services, as I mentioned earlier, and that category includes housing, food, nutrition, mental health services, transportation, cash assistance, all vital life-saving services that we have heard have been especially fundamental during COVID-19, so particularly concerning to see that decrease. And another pivotal funding tool, of course, general operating support, saw a 13% decline as well. If we go on to the next slide, populations of focus. As I mentioned, there is a new look and feel here. Rather than a standard list in declining order as we've done in the past, we've bucketed the categories into groups according to our taxonomy. So you can see them and compare them in this context. The top 5 funded populations have a black box next to them in the chart, and general population is the top funded. That is typical at 300 million this year. That category is closely aligned with the research category because a majority of research funding targets the general population. The second top funded population would be people living with HIV, where there is no particular subcategory or subpopulation specified, and that came in at 183 million. We then saw women and girls at 76 million, youth ages 15 to 24 at 58 million, and healthcare workers at 38 million. And if we go to the next slide, we're just going to zoom in a little bit on a couple of population groups. As I mentioned, we have a focus on BIPOC communities in the US and one on key populations across the globe towards the end of the report. And these are really just scratching the surface. We did do a full data spotlight on BIPOC communities with our 2018 data, and we just wanted to revisit some of those numbers. But we found a slight increase in funding to BIPOC communities in the US in 2019, up just over 1 million. And just to clarify, we don't yet have the capacity to track funding to BIPOC-led organizations. So this is the entire pool of funding that we were able to identify as targeting BIPOC communities, but coming through any organization. So you can imagine that pool of funding for BIPOC-led orgs would be significantly smaller. And again, with key populations, this includes people who inject drugs, gay men and other men who have sex with men, transgender communities, sex workers, and LGBT folks more broadly. We saw a 12% decrease in funding overall since 2018. When we look at each individual population within that category, again, we saw decreases almost across the board. And I have them listed out there with a 31% decrease to people who inject drugs and so forth. We know that both HIV and COVID-19 have had disproportionate impacts on these communities, and seeing these decreases in funding before the impact of COVID-19 again is an alarming sign. So I know it may seem that I have just read the entire report to you, and I know I moved through that really quickly because I want to save time for the conversations that we're going to have with our funders that are joining us. But I do assure you there is more. And if we go to the next slide, you will find in the report some snapshots on top 5 funders in various categories, and you will find a full spread map of global funding with the top funders, strategies, and populations listed per region. So please check out the report, and please help me to welcome our panelists so we can bring some of this data to life and think strategically about how funders can and are responding. As they get their videos turned on, I'm just going to do brief introductions from their bios. So Paul Gilbert is the new coordinator of Red Umbrella Fund since August of last year. He previously worked as program manager for the global network of sex work projects, was program coordinator for Solidarity FIDA, and was a civil society member of the International Steering Committee of the Robert Carr Fund. His full bio is on our website, and we'll put it in the chat as well, so you can read about his multiple master's degrees across Europe and his multilingual capacity that will put us all to shame. Or I should only speak for myself. So welcome, Paul Gilbert. I also want to welcome Darwin Thompson. He's Associate Director for Corporate Giving at Gilead, where he manages their domestic HIV grant making. He has more than 10 years of experience working with community-based organizations, providing social and support services for marginalized populations. Before Gilead, he served as Executive Director for a community nonprofit organization in Atlanta focused on HIV prevention for Black gay men. Please find his full bio online as well, and we can pop it into the chat, where you can read more about his many accolades from Morehouse College and his side gig as a referee for women's college basketball. Very exciting. Welcome, Darwin. I kind of want like one of those like fake applause sounds right now, just so I don't feel like we're in this quiet virtual world. Thank you both for joining. I want to dive right into the questions so we have time to chat. And as I ask you the first question, feel free to open with anything else that you want, if there's anything else you want to say about yourself. But I'm going to start with you, Paul Gilbert, if that's okay. Can you just take a few minutes to respond to the data, share any concerns you have with funding levels that we've reported on, and then take a few more minutes to talk about how the Red Umbrella Fund is responding and supporting its own communities, and any thoughts for other funders to consider in their own responses.
Sure. Thank you very much, Kat. It was very insightful. My first name is Paul Gilbert, as you said, and I work as coordinator of Red Umbrella Fund. For those who don't know Red Umbrella Fund is the first and only global fund for and by sex workers. So the only thing I would add to my bio is that I did work as a sex worker as well, and I think that gave me skills that made me efficient in my work today as well. I'll speak more about the data relating to key populations, because as the report highlights, and despite an overall increase in total philanthropy giving to HIV/AIDS in 2019, almost every population tracked within the key populations category experienced substantial declines in funding in 2019. Only the general lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer questioning LGBTQ population saw a slight increase from 2018 to 2019. So I think besides from the data from this new tracking report, we can also see other data. At the end of last year, AIDS Funds published a report highlighting that in 2018, sex workers accounted for 6% of all new HIV infections globally. Their clients, as well as sexual partners of other key populations, accounted for another 18% of new infections. And yet, programs for sex workers received only 0.6% of all HIV expenditures, and only 3% of estimated prevention funding in low and middle income countries between 2016 and 2018. So to me, the data exemplifies trends that continue to show that funding for key populations is going down. And that's a concern for me, but besides being a concern, it's also something that's not new nor unexpected. And it's not new because FCAA has called for increased attention and funding for key populations in previous reports, which did not result in increased funding for key populations. It's also not new because a few weeks ago in a webinar organized by FCAA, Stasha Plechas, the executive director of the Sex Workers' Rights Advocacy Network, which is a sex worker-led network in Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia, pointed out what these trends mean in practice for key populations and their organizations, and called for increased core funding for key populations. And again, it's not new because since its existence, it's now been more than 30 years, the sex workers' rights funding movement has been calling for more funding attuned to sex workers' needs, and funding that is rights-based and evidence-based. So to me, I have two reactions when I see these data. My first one is a reaction of weariness. Whilst we as HIV funders were once champions of meaningful involvements that truly gave a central role to affected communities, our discourse now seems a bit stale and a bit untrue, and our actions seem not to match our words when we see the funding for key populations that keep going down. So another reaction is bewilderment. I can't explain why funders, including us as funders who should be concerned about AIDS, do not focus our efforts on most affected populations. And I'm trying to find answers. So the only potential answer I can find is that maybe some of us think that the funding for key populations will come from other sources than philanthropic funders, because the report that we're discussing excludes public funding, for instance. But it's important to remember that governments do not fund populations they criminalize, and they do not fund key population-led organizations to continue the advocacy to change the laws that the government themselves implement and that hinder the HIV response. So it's because of laws designed and implemented by governments that criminalize, stigmatize, discriminate against us, that we as key populations and our sexual partners account for the majority of new global HIV infections. So it leads me to wonder whether we're truly concerned about AIDS and what we are truly doing to contribute to an end to this epidemic, whilst not readjusting our work and funding when data has consistently told us to do so. And then to answer the second part of your question briefly, Kat, you were asking how Red Umbrella Fund is responding. I think we had a strategic review that was done in 2019 that resulted in the launch of our new 2020-2025 strategic plan. We launched it on the 15th of September last year, sorry, the 14th of September. The 14th of September is an International Sex Worker Pride Day. And that strategic review informed the message in the strategic plan, which reaffirmed our role and the crucial need for us to continue existing as a global sex worker-led participatory grant-making mechanism, providing core support to sex worker-led organizations according to their needs and priorities. And HIV and AIDS remains a priority in many of the applications that we receive. You were also asking for recommendations, and recently we worked with the Global Philanthropy Project, trying to look at the data about LGBTI funding to see whether LGBTI funding was going or not to LGBTI sex workers. And in this document, we highlighted some recommendations, some of which I think can apply here. And they are increase explicit funding to key population-led organizations and networks, ensure the meaningful involvement of key populations representatives in funding processes and decisions. And to those, I would add, be more evidence than HIV informed, act changes within your individual organizations. And if you are concerned about AIDS, fund key populations at the level they are affected and put communities in the lead.
Thank you, Paul Gilbert. And maybe some folks on the line can chime in on the chat throughout this conversation if they have things to add. I would love to hear from funders on the line about, barriers or challenges that they might experience in funding key populations, or questions they might have to the speakers about ways to overcome those. So Darwin, I'm going to pose the same question to you. If you want to respond to the data, share any concerns you have with funding levels, particularly within the US, of course, and then how Gilead is responding to support communities, and any other thoughts for funders to consider in their own responses.
Absolutely. So Kat, first, thank you, and John, for having me, and Paul, brilliant, right? Brilliant. And so I think when we look at the US, right, and Kat, you gave a really brilliant overview of the data, but I kind of want to just make sure that I'm, echoing what you're saying around things that I see when it comes to funding levels. And I think particularly when we look at the US South, everyone knows that 45% of people living with HIV live in the US South. But to see a decrease in funding, and yes, there's sustained efforts like COMPAS and the Southern HIV Impact Fund, but we really need to continue to make a concerted effort to put funding into areas where we see those most impacted. And I think when we think about funding in those areas, and I'm just going to stay in the US South for a second, we need to look at BIPOC-led organizations. We need to, but more specifically, right, we need to look at trans-led organizations. We need to look at organizations that are led by MSM of color, Latinx MSM of color, because I think when we look at BIPOC-led or funding in BIPOC communities, we often lump them together, right? We need to start to figure out how much money are going to these individual organizations and communities and look at opportunities to scale up projects and services. You know, I always say, especially MSM-led organizations, and particularly trans-led organizations, these organizations were not created, they were created out of a need, right? Those individuals saw a need that wasn't being addressed by non-BIPOC-led organizations, and they created these organizations. And yet, and still, they're not funded at the same levels that these other organizations are. And the other thing that we looked at in the report, and we see it, you know, with general operating support, right? And so I think as funders, sometimes we're hesitant to just provide general operating support for these smaller organizations. But when we think about looking at organizational sustainability and how those unrestricted funds can really help to advance those organizations 3 to 5 years, because it really frees up revenue to hire a development director, hire someone to do policy so that they can advocate for funds and those types of things. So we really want to look at, and I think it's important that we really begin to identify opportunities to provide discretionary unrestricted funds to organizations, specifically population-led organizations within trans and MSM communities. I think the other thing that when we look at funding is this drop. Like, I didn't realize that it was such a drastic drop in funding for support services, nearly 30%. And when we think about COVID, right, and how COVID exacerbated these communities and how ASOs and CBOs had to step up to the plate to provide these critical services with increase in mental health services or, you know, subsidies around grocery vouchers or transportation. You know, we really need to think about how do we provide opportunities to increase our funding for support services. And I think that is really troubling, especially when we need to use a more than medicine approach to ending the HIV epidemic. We can't get people into our doors until we address the barriers that prevent them from getting into our offices or onto a mobile testing unit. And so I think that, you know, to see such a drastic drop in funding for support services is really, you know, devastating. And I think we need to figure out ways to increase those services, whether it's opportunities to do more collaborations or, you know, more coalition building, those types of things. And then I think that, you know, what you didn't share, and I think was interesting when I looked at the report as far as, you know, in the US where what's being funded. And I think there's an opportunity to look at this epidemic in a status neutral approach. So when we looked at treatment funding versus funding for prevention, it was almost tripled. I think treatment funding was at 97 million and funding for prevention was about 39 million. And we understand that U equals U works, right? If you're undetectable, you're untransmittable. But I also think that we need to make a concerted effort to support comprehensive prevention, whether it's in the biomedical form, but if it's other strategies. And so figuring out a way to provide status neutral funding so that organizations can find the right intervention for someone, regardless of their status, is going to be important. So if there are opportunities to increase funding and prevention to the levels of treatment, is going to be key to ending the epidemic in the US. But I think we need to not silo it into treatment or prevention, but allow organizations to find the best intervention for that individual at the time of engagement, right? And so I think also when we think about what we've done at Gilead, and I think that 2020 was a unique year. And I think when we look at the 2019 data, and I think looking at the 2020 data, it's going to be really interesting. COVID exacerbated, you know, how we thought about grant making. But I also think it gave funders an opportunity to reimagine how they do grant making, right? Whether it was, you know, just some of the responses that Gilead did was allowing grantees to unrestrict those programmatic grants so they can focus on immediate needs, whether it was launching our COVID relief efforts, which to the tune of 20 million, which supported about 10 million in the US, but then also another 3 million in Australia, Canada, and Europe, where we see, high rates of HIV. And so I think we have that, but then also thinking about our Compass initiative, providing additional grant making so they can provide rapid response grants to their communities, but also to trans-led organizations as well. We saw the one thing that was so critical, and we saw that the trans community was very resilient, from them raising resources for grocery vouchers or, food during COVID. And I think that providing opportunities to have, for trans-led organizations to make rapid response grants to their communities, because we saw that it was needed on an individual level as well as an organizational level. So finding opportunities to be really flexible with how communities are supported in times of need, right? I think the other thing that was interesting after we got past the initial shock and awe of COVID and how it decimated our organizations was to really reframe what was needed from organizations. So whether it was providing technical assistance grants or capacity building grants, so they really could do a deep dive internally around what's needed so that they can be successful over the next 3 to 5 years and really provide those resources. We heard from a number of partners that said, no funder or not many funders have really invested into our overall organizational sustainability, right? So how do we help you create a fundraising plan or, address your IT needs? There wasn't resources to address the internal sustainability, but always wanted to focus on programmatic work. And so, and I think the other thing that as funders, when we think about 2020 or just the COVID epidemic and how we kind of come out of this is those multi-year funding opportunities, right? We at the end of last year identified opportunities to support our partners with not just 1-year grants, but multi-year grants, because I think the time that it takes for organizations and program staff to collect data and financial reports is a burden sometimes when they could use that time to research other funding opportunities or do other things that can really lead to sustainability. So the churn and burn of just collecting data and sending applications. And so where it's possible, create your strategic partners where you can fund them in 2 to 3 year intervals so that they can spend that time actually implementing programs and not trying to ramp up every year, but then also they understand that they're long-term partners and their opportunities for long-term sustainability. And so I think the thing when we think about COVID and what we'll see in 2020, I think the biggest thing was, especially smaller organizations, was the ability to fundraise, right? A lot of these organizations couldn't put on their galas and walks, and those are critical areas of funding with unrestricted revenue. So I think we're going to see gaps in budgets over the next couple of years because they haven't been able to raise those revenues from individuals or from corporate funders. So I think if there are opportunities as funders to reach into our pockets and increase, and grants or unrestricted grants so that we can cover up some of those budget shortfalls, because as these organizations budget shrink, then the level of services that they're providing to the most marginal has the potential to reduce. And we're looking at, and I'm speaking from the perspective of these grassroots small organizations, not these large health systems or these FQRCs, these organizations that were created out of a need are the ones that has the potential to suffer the most with loss in funding. And then lastly, we've heard directly from organizations that, we need to figure out ways, and the data shows, how do we sustain these critical support services, right? With the stay-at-home orders, we've seen increased needs for telehealth services, not from a prevention and treatment standpoint, but telehealth services for individuals who are suffering from mental health issues or substance use that need substance use counseling. And so how do we find opportunities as funders to increase funding for telehealth services, right? And it's just not telehealth for clinical services, but telehealth for support groups. I think, looking at the Thrive SS model in Atlanta, who use an online-based support service group, is one of those areas that we can figure out how do we replicate from an organizational standpoint. How do we look at status neutral support services? We think about what comprehensive prevention looks like. but are we really finding an opportunity to provide, those support groups or mental health services for people who aren't living with HIV? And so I think there are opportunities to increase services there. And then lastly, I think it's important, right? So our partners finally got out of the brick and mortar, and people didn't have to come in to receive services. How do we really, look at the advances in at-home testing, right? Because I think that's an opportunity to, I'm using air quotes here, we hear often we can't find them, they're hard to find, but how do we really use an opportunity as funders to fund efforts around at-home testing and at-home services for individuals and not create another barrier, because COVID has shown that we don't have to have people walking through our doors. How do we decrease the barrier or increase the at-home testing so people don't have to come into the office for services? And so I think, I said a lot, but I think COVID has really given us some opportunities to be innovative in unrestricted areas, innovative in how we fund programs, especially programs with key populations. But then also, when we look at the 2019 data, we really have to reverse those trends in some of the decreases in areas that are critical to key populations.
Thank you, Darwin. Yes, lots said there, and thank you for all of that. I think that's really valuable. I'm thinking back to, being on Funding Forward last week, and even previous panels that FCAA has hosted. We hear a lot, you have to trust the community to do what they can with the funding. They're the people that know, and I think that message is sort of resonating with what both of you are saying right now, a message of trust, which is something that we need to carry through a lot. I'm gonna dive into the next question for you, Paul Gilbert, but if you have any other thoughts you want to add in on top of this, I saw you nodding a lot, and I know that we gained a little time back, so feel free to say more. But I'm just want to know if there's any ways that this data is useful in supporting your work specifically in the past or moving forward, or ways that it can be more useful. I think when we put this report out, obviously we want it to be beneficial for funders and for communities. We want people to be able to utilize it and take it with them and help guide their funding with it. So anything that you can say that you found useful with the data points, or that you might want to see more of that we can take with us moving forward.
Sure. Thank you, Kat. I was nodding a lot because I completely agree. And the thematics of trusting key populations is a topic that we often talk about, but that when we see the reports with such data, it's difficult to see where the actions are. And I think besides trust, there's a real expertise in key populations and their experiences. But to answer that question that you just asked me, Kat, it's a very interesting question for me to respond to, because as coordinator of Red Umbrella Fund, I work for a fund that has different sides to it. So firstly, we're a fund, that's clear, that's our main role. Our main role is to catalyze more and better funding for sex worker-led organizations and networks worldwide. But I also work for a community-led fund. So at Red Umbrella Fund, the decision-making bodies, our International Steering Committee, our Program Advisory Committee, our Secretariat staff, mainly include people with sex work experience. And I also work for an intermediary funder. So the funding that we are able to give as Red Umbrella Fund is funding that we need to fundraise for. So I think in these three roles, the data in that report has several kinds of values to me moving forward. As a funder, it has an intellectual value. So it helps me and the Red Umbrella Fund guide our work to continue funding in a way that is evidence and HIV-based. So the data supports us in making the case also for more funding for sex worker-led organizations and networks worldwide, because we see that there's a need that is not matched. As a community-led organizations, passionately now, not intellectually, it can give me and other community members the rage that I hope can be turned into a positive force for change, rather than remain the weariness that I was speaking about earlier. And as an intermediary funder, practically, it worries me a little bit, because it worries me about the long-term existence of intermediary community-led funders. And that's despite an increased interest in participatory grant making. because we saw that there was a decrease in intermediary funders as well. So I much prefer the term community-led funds as well, as opposed to intermediary funder, because I think just like communities, in the funding world, we should be central mechanisms in the way we're used, including by other funders, to disperse funds. So I think the data is very useful intellectually, passionately, and practically.
Wow, very, very well thought through response. Thank you. And useful to see the different layers and think about that. And I think your position is really unique, because we do create support and hope that it's used by funders and by community members and by advocates and so forth. And so you definitely have a lot of those different perspectives. So thank you for sharing. Darwin, I'm going to ask you the same question, and if there's anything else you want to tag onto that, feel free as well.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of my comments for this question, I've already said, so if I repeat myself, apologies, but this is something I'm really passionate about. I think when we look at the data, right, the data of this report is there, right? We see where we've increased, we see where we decreased. Especially in the US, we know areas of need, especially in the US South, we know populations of need, right? So I think the question is an internal question, right? As funders, yes, we have our budgets and we have limited resources, but how do we align ourselves with the most critical areas, right? How do we say, if our budget is 10 million, do we say, because the US South has this much of an epidemic, all of this part of our budget is going to go there? So do we start to prioritize our budget and partners where the need is? So I think that's what this report should be able to do, is it should help you to prioritize, right? The second thing is, I'm going to go back to it, is how do we look at our funding from a racial justice lens? Are we funding BIPOC-led organizations, trans-led, MSM of color-led organizations, or are we funding BIPOC initiatives? And what I mean by that is, are the organizations, that we're funding doing work within this community, but we're not actually supporting the organizations that are led by the community? And I think that's a difference, right? I think, and Kat, you said we don't have the data to show where the BIPOC-led funding is going, but as funders, I think we have a due diligence that we can do around, how do we support these community organizations, right? I think that it's not saying, well, you're a smaller organization, so your cap is this. We're only going to fund you at $50,000 because based on your budget. How are we making these investments into these BIPOC-led organizations that we really are helping to increase their overall sustainability? And so I think we need to, really do an internal look to make sure that we're just not funding BIPOC initiatives, but we're funding BIPOC-led. And then lastly, I think, from a US perspective, I think this report is great when we look at, our EHE initiative, right? So I think we should be able to use this report and the data from FCAA to make sure that we're aligning our funding up with EHE, which is our national response to ending the HIV epidemic, right? I think the thing that's going to be critical about EHE is that it's not just funding the state, but making sure that our dollars are going to those jurisdictions. So it's not funding Georgia, but it's making sure that if the EHE jurisdiction is Fulton County, that we're actually funding organizations that are working directly in Fulton County so that the resources are going to the community. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to, again, to reimagine how we support communities and making sure that our dollars are going to the local level and not just the state, regional, and national level, but really to those communities most hard hit. And I think that this report gives you the opportunity to do that. So if there's nothing else, it would be to make sure that, we're prioritizing from a racial justice lens, BIPOC-led and not BIPOC initiatives. Understanding that the data should help prioritize, where your resources are going, and then really looking at from an EHE perspective that we are drilling down our funding to those jurisdictions and to those organizations working with community and at those levels.
Thanks, Darwin. Yeah, absolutely. We definitely have been thinking a lot about how we might be able to more closely align our data with the ending the HIV epidemic initiative within the US, and if we can get it down to that jurisdiction level, so that we can really look at philanthropic funding and compare to those needs in that context. And so, hopefully something in the future might be able to come out of that, definitely. I want to pause and just see if we have any questions from the audience. We have some great speakers here, so please feel free to utilize them. You can put a question in the chat box or in the Q&A, or if you want to raise your hand, we can take you off mute, I believe, and you can speak with your voice. If not, I have a question. It's a little self-serving, but if no one else is going to take advantage of the two of you, I will. You know, obviously, we talked a lot about this being pre-COVID-19 data, and we're moving into 2020 data collection basically as soon as we step off this webinar and to get the ball rolling again. And so we've been thinking a lot about how that data collection needs to shift a little bit to be able to account for COVID-related funding. And can either of you speak to, as funders who report to us, both of you, how it might be useful for you to report on any changes your data has made with because of COVID? So if you would say, you know, here's our typical grant list, and we, you know, these have all changed, increased by X because of COVID, or here's our regular grants, and then here's our other grants that are COVID related, or anything that you might think is useful for the data reporting. And it's not just for FCAA, but I know lots of people in the philanthropic world who do resource tracking are thinking a lot about how we make sure that we understand the impact of COVID on the levels of philanthropic funding. So if either of you have any thoughts on that, feel free to jump in.
I mean, I think that, and this is from a Gilead perspective, right? I think that one of the things that you potentially could see from Gilead is that where we would normally have funded programmatic grants to organizations, that they just didn't submit them because they didn't have the ability or the bandwidth to submit requests, right? And so you may see that there were increases in funding for COVID-related general operating support, but there may be a decrease in population or programmatic specific requests because organizations just didn't have the bandwidth to, you know, to submit those applications because they were just going through so much in the time of COVID. But you also may see increases because we increased funding when it came to multi-year grants to partners, right? And so I think those are two areas where we'll need to have a conversation around, like, how do we distill the data? Because it may seem like we gave, you know, organization X amount of dollars, but it was over multi-year. And so while those dollars will be counted in 2020, you know, those resources should go to 2022, 2023. So it may seem like an increase, but it's actually a sustained gift. And so I think those are just areas that we have been just kind of thinking about internally, was that, you know, the increase in funding to our HIV organizations because of COVID, the decrease in programmatic grants because they didn't have the bandwidth, and then the multi-year grants that we sent to organizations. So while it may seem steady, I think the data will ebb and flow. So if there's an opportunity to carve out, you know, specific COVID funding that went to these organizations, I think is going to be key. Because if you don't, we definitely we'll probably continue to see a decrease in critical services for key populations.
Yeah, can I jump on, Kat? I think for Red Umbrella Fund, because we're an intermediary funder, it's slightly different. So we gather funding, we try to fundraise to give 70% of our annual budget in grants through an annual call for proposal. So we didn't have extra funding to give when the COVID crisis hit, but we were lucky that we were providing core flexible support in line with the needs. So I think to see the real shifts, we would have to have a look at how many of our grantees asked for reprogramming, how many of our grantees reported that they changed their activities. And that will give more of an indication of amounts, because of the way we function does not allow us to vary the amounts that we give. I think what would be interesting as well is to see where the organizations that we fund are funded and whether they're going to continue to be funded that way, because I am not optimistic about what happened in 2020. I feel like most of the sex worker-led organizations and networks that we fund face the same issue that we faced as a sex worker-led fund, which is that most of the donors started retreating, saying that their core business was women's rights, the general women's population, LGBT rights, the general LGBT populations. So again, the populations most marginalized and stigmatized were left behind.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's interesting to consider for us. We're getting close, but there was one question that came in the chat that I'd like to lift up. FCAA's COVID-19 report highlights the importance of intermediary and community-based funders. Do you have any ideas about how FCAA can help to move more money through intermediary funders? Gilbert, I would say that's for you.
Yes. I do think participatory grant making is gaining traction and has gained incredible traction in the last 5-6 months. Huge funders like Mama Cash, that's the fund that hosts Red Umbrella Fund, by the way, a women-led fund that was created in the 80s, I believe, moved to participatory grant making. I'm part of a group of funders that share initiatives and learning on participatory grant making. We were 90 people at the end of last year. We're now 300 people. And I think whilst the people in these conversations are in funding organizations that want to implement participatory grant making themselves, when we start speaking about, yeah, but you won't have to use legal names, you'll have to be able to fund an organization that cannot register because they can't mention sex work in their name because otherwise the government will deny them their registration, then it becomes a lot more difficult for them. And I think part of shifting the power to become a participatory grant maker is also reflecting on yourself, but it's also investing in community-led funds by recognizing the expertise of these funds.
Can I add something here that I think is important? I also think that, we have to look at opportunities, especially corporate funders, right? When we think about intermediate or pass-through funding, to find opportunities to partner with new organizations to make them pass-through funders. I think we often go back to the same groups, and I think that, and I look at, our Compass initiative where we partner with organizations who historically haven't been grant makers, but they had the pulse on their community. Or, with our Transcend initiative where we partner with a new organization and allowed them and gave them the capacity to be a grant maker because they knew what was best for their community. And so I think that we have the ability to create new funders and new collaborations through our will and the place that we sit in this space. And so instead of going to the same organizations, I think there are opportunities to work with new partners. And I think that's going to be critical as we think about, the rest of 2021 and what's on the horizon for 2022 and 2023.
Thank you, Darwin. Thanks to both of you. I think we're just about at time, and I want to just appreciate both of you for joining us, for sharing, for making this conversation more than just numbers and slides, which I think is really important to bring the numbers off the page and give funders something to think about and how to really take away a message from all of this. It's been really valuable for me as well. I want to just plug that we are going to be launching our data collection for 2020 data soon. So I will be reaching out, and I want to continue this conversation with other funders. So as I do reach out, if there are ways that we can have a little more of a dialogue than usual about how submitting data will change a little bit so that we can adjust for COVID-related grants, please engage with me on that. So thank you again. I'm going to pass it back to John Barnes, our Executive Director, to wrap us up and close us out.
Thanks, Kat. I just want to share a little bit about what's coming up from FCAA. On June 2nd, we will have a webinar featuring representatives from the Biden administration in both the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator and the Domestic Policy Council to talk about the administration's priorities for HIV domestically and globally. Additionally, we'll have a representative from the Global Fund to talk about the plans that they have for continuing to try to mediate the impacts of COVID-19 and getting back on track globally. And then, of course, we have the FCAA Summit coming up November 8th and 9th. We're going to be trying a hybrid format for folks who can join us in DC in person. We welcome you. For those who aren't yet ready to travel, there will be an opportunity to join virtually. So I hope you'll join us for both of those things, and stay tuned to our blog and periodic updates. I want to reiterate Kat's thanks to our two speakers today, but I also want to thank Kat for her amazing work in pulling this report together, and all of you for listening today. This report is really for you, HIV funders, but we also hope it's used by advocates to inform your work. And we're always open to new ideas about how to do the report differently, about information that you would like to see. So please give us feedback, and have a great day. Thanks, everyone.